Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. In the Johnson edition, we turn now to poem 391, A Visitor in Marl. There's a lot of debate about this Marl and what exactly are we referencing here. This is another riddle poem. In this regards, we're going to be talking about the frost, but it will take a while for us to get there. You'll maybe recall that we've already shared with you that Emily said about these riddle poems and the like, quote, "The riddle we can guess, we speedily despise." She says this in poem 1222. And in a letter to Sue, letter 586, she said, quote, "In a life that stopped guessing, you and I should not feel at home." Now, it is interesting, these riddle poems. Anthony Height, the great scholar of Emily Dickinson, has suggested that Emily used the riddle form not because of, quote, ladylike reticence, but rather a religious seriousness, however unorthodox, and a profound sense that neither life itself nor the holy text by which we interpret it is altogether intelligible, and both require a riddling mind or interpretive skill, end quote. He also goes on to argue that this tradition she's drawing on is both a biblical tradition as well as children's nursery rhymes, like, for example, the Mother Goose, which is possibly standing behind some of what we're doing here. Now, our assumptions are that you followed our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hoping that you've worked through our set of introductory comments as well as our preceding 390 poems. We just finished with 390, it's coming. And if you have, then you can place this poem in a matrix of a number of other riddle poems, nature poems, and the like. A scholar has pointed it out this way: the frost as an artist, Emily will be playing with. The frost as an artist that does not approve of nature as it is, but would rather correct it into something more formal, more malleable, if you will. Forced. A bust, for example, a transparent wine glass. We will see this as we read. I also want to point out the sexual language of this poem, which makes it a controversial poem right away. A visitor in Marl, who influences flowers till they are orderly as busts and elegant as glass, who visits in the night and just before the sun concludes his glistening interview, caresses, and is gone, but whom his fingers touched, and where his feet have run, and whatsoever mouth he kissed, is as it had not been. Now, one scholar has called this the ravish into oblivion, and I find that a fascinating way to think about it. Now, this is the late autumn frost, of course, that will kill the remaining flowers. That we can kind of assume is going on here, but Marl is fascinating. Are we talking about the name of a town? Are we talking about, the great scholar Farr has pointed out that maybe we're talking about marble, given that there's a reference that in a letter for Emily where she actually talks about the possibility of Marl as marble. In letter 432 of January 1875 to Mrs. Holland, Emily said it this way, quote, "Mother is asleep in the library, Vinny in the dining room, father in the masked bed in the Marl house." The masked bed would be, of course, her father's coffin in the Marl house, his grave with the marble headstone. So is that what we're talking about with Marl? Some have referenced it as dew, and we'll play that game in poem 782 when we have the juxtaposition of frost versus the dew. A visitor in Marl who, notice, influences is the word here, flowers. Of course, what we're really saying is kills flowers, till they are orderly as busts and elegant as glass. Now, some have pointed out that if you read Marl as a town, we're playing maybe around with Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. We've given full lectures on it at learnstrong.net. But you'll remember that pious little town at the end of the poem in part 4 that's emptied, that maybe Marl is kind of being referenced in that regards. Now, notice the visitor will influence the flowers, till they're orderly as busts. In other words, they're dead, they're frozen, right, covered in frost, and elegant as glass. And then this visitor, notice the repetition of who visits in the night, and just before the sun concludes his glistening interview. I mean, I can't read a line like that without pointing out that we did call our series Chats with Emily for a reason such as this. Caresses and is gone. Now, there is a reading of this whole thing of Marl as it relates to her reading of Paradise Lost. You'll remember in book 1, roughly line 292, that the devils walk on a burning floor of marl or claying soil in hell. And in this regards, Emily is playing around with the destructive force of nature. In other words, these beautiful flowers are there, and then all of a sudden frost comes along and caresses them, and then is of course gone. Many have read the sectoral language here as having maybe a figurative rendering as well. And whom, now we're go from who to whom his fingers touched, and where his feet have run, and whatsoever mouth he kissed. Go back to poem 11 for referencing of kissing. Notice it's not lips, it's mouth. Is as it had not been. In other words, something has changed once the frost settles in, namely, of course, death itself. When we get to poem 1624, we'll play around similarly this way. Apparently with no surprise to any happy flower, the frost beheads it at its play in accidental power. The blonde assassin passes on. The sun proceeds unmoved to measure off another day for an approving God. The destructive forces of nature. And I think this is the point at 2a, that nature has both a constructive and a destructive force. She wants to see both sides. At 2b, well, obviously the sexual language is fascinating. At 3a, the scholar Wolfe has pointed out fascinating study of this poem, and more particularly the references to the book of Job from the Bible, and the way in which that book of Job allows for there to be referencing to the frost, to the frozenness of the ground and the like. For example, in Job 26, 5 through 7, he stretcheth out the north over the empty place. Dead things are formed from under the waters, that passage says. Hell is naked before him. In Job 38, 29 through 30, out of whose womb came the ice and the hoary frost of heaven, who hath gendered it. The waters are hid as with a stone, and the face of the deep is frozen. And then, of course, Job 37:10, by the breath of God, plod nothing so much as the devastation by cold. By the breath of God, frost is given. This idea then that she's maybe referencing in the book of Job the destructive force of the frost. Finally, at 3b, what are your views of nature as both constructive as well as destructive? It reminds us a lot of our study of Emerson and Thoreau, doesn't it? Emily is transcendentalist, huh? Thank you.